Hello, and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris,
I'm Randall.
and welcome to the show. Today we're going to talk about adaptations, film adaptations, particularly theater that's made into film, works of fiction that are made into film, and comic books that are made into film. When do they work? When do they fail? And why and how does this happen? Why is some things more successful and some things aren't? We're going to take the deep dive, but before that, as always, please like us because we're very insecure. Comment because we really want to know what you have to say. Subscribe to us because we want to see you every time we put out content, and share because I bet your friends would really like to join in on the conversation. Hey, Randall, what's the best way to reach us, or what's one of the ways to reach us?
Well, just check our website first of all, chrisandrandall.com. And our Facebook page is a good way. Arts and Entertainment with Chris and Randall is our Facebook page. That's fun.
Yeah, we want to know what you think, especially this week's episode. It's kind of timely. So anyway, just this week, a Broadway Tony Award-winning musical came out, and it was pillared by the film critics, and it lost a lot of money. It was called Dear Evan Hansen, and it only came out on Broadway a few years ago, and it won a Tony. And there's a movie coming out, I think, next week or this week. Everyone's excited to see James Bond. Are you excited to see James Bond?
Sure.
And it's getting good reviews already, and it will probably make a lot of money. And the thing that James Bond shares with Dear Evan Hansen is it's an adaptation of these short stories written by a man named Ian Fleming. So there is good, successful adaptations, and there are disasters. And again, I did some research, and in the last 20 years of Oscar, there's a section in the Academy Awards called Best Adapted Screenplay, supposed to an original screenplay. And half of them, in the last 20 years, half of the best adapted screenplays have been adaptations of novels. And then two of them were adaptations of plays, and one of them was an adaptation of a short story. So you do see that sometimes these books, these plays, these short stories, they get Academy Awards. I was looking at the top 20 highest grossing films of all time. 6 of them are comic books, all of them based on Marvel Comics. 4 of them were based on 2 novels, either Harry Potter or Jurassic Park. So whether you're looking at it from an aesthetic standpoint, Randall, or a financial standpoint, adaptations are a real big part of film going and filmmaking. Why do you think, just curious to know, what do successful stories, why do you think there's such a desire to do them, to make these? You know what I'm saying? I'm not saying that Hollywood isn't creative. I'm just saying, why do you think...
It's just about making money. I mean, something's been a huge success in another medium. It's like, of course, you want to piggyback off the success of that.
Do you think ever there's also just people who saw a book or a play or a comic and they said, man, I love this, and I work in film, and I just want to share it with the world? I mean, I know Ron Howard really fell in love with the play Frost Nixon, and he championed that. I know Rob Reiner fell in love with the play A Few Good Men. I know there are people. I know Jon Favreau was in love with Ironman and really, wanted to make the movie. So I think there's definitely people who work in film. Would you say?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's something
fanboy-ism.
There's something about, and you see this from the birth of the cinema. Even there's something about the cinema, about video, that lends itself to people wanting to remake other works, and it's something you definitely notice all throughout the history of cinema. I mean, it's not the kind of genre like novels maybe are different, right? I mean, people want to write an original novel.
Like, I want to write a novel because I love another novel so much, or I want to write a novel because I loved a comic book so much, or I want to write a novel because I loved a movie so much. I mean, yeah, once in a blue moon, you will get a Wicked. I was just reading for this show, Gregory Maguire, who wrote a book based on the Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch. But 99% of all novels that are written are like, I want to talk about how hard it is to be living on a range in 1870s Nebraska, or I want to write a book about my alcoholic father and what it was like to come up raising in the 1950s and make it a veiled. But my point is, you're right. Most people who are writing, they're not writing to think, man, what a great movie. What I really love is movies.
Yeah, I mean, remaking stuff is like it goes way back to the early days of Hollywood. It's probably something about the medium. In the early days of Hollywood, they would remake the same movie like, I don't know, like every 10 years or so. I mean, like
Yeah.
I mean, they're still doing it, obviously. I mean, Ben-Hur was remade, like, I don't know. How many Ben-Hurs do we have now? 3 or 4? I'm not sure.
Too many. And we should definitely do an episode about Hollywood's love of remaking films. And while it loves remaking films, it also loves taking popular plays and movies, and now even comic books, and making them into film. And I guess my question to you is, overall, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges to cinematic adaptations, just in general, not specific to the genre? Do you think it's trying to get the camera involved in the storytelling?
No, I think the biggest issue is always how close do you get to the source material? How faithful are you to the source material? I mean, you look all the way back to a film like Greed, in the silent days, the director of Greed wanted to shoot every single page of the novel. I mean, that's what he's literally said. So, I mean, it's always an open question. Like, how close do you get, to that source material?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think you're right. There's always that. You're always trying to, like, as someone who goes to see it, there's always the expectation of, I want that same experience that I had in the original source material. And as a filmmaker, I think you're trying to translate whatever that experience was for the reader, because everything we're talking, or theater audience, but translate it into the language of cinema. And I think, yeah, like any language, things get lost in translation. Some of the best outcomes clearly are the films that we just mentioned that, win Academy Awards, or Best Actor, because the magic of that particular adaptation was there. It made $300 million in the box office, or it won a whole bunch of awards because, there's just they translated the language well. Whereas like the worst outcomes are just the opposite. It's like, no, I mean, like, surely you have seen stuff, and we're going to get into it in specific in a moment, but in a more general sense, is there nothing more disappointing than to see something that's a film version of something you liked in another genre of medium, and they just totally miss it?
Well, yeah, that's usually what happens. I mean,
but that's what happens for Randall. I root for a lot of things I love to be good, and I mean, this could be a much longer show, but I'm going to dive into my area of expertise, which is theater and adaptations of musicals, because we've already talked about Evan Hansen, and what we call in the theater community straight plays, or just plays, meaning where they don't sing, where they just talk like we are right now. So I want to be really clear. There are filmed versions of plays, which, like, if you right now have Disney Plus, for example, you can watch Hamilton, or you can watch Come From Far Away, or if you have YouTube, you can watch the Royal Shakespeare or the National Theater, and you can see a play where they put cameras on stage. I'm not talking about that. That's its own thing, and maybe we'll do an episode on that. I'm really talking about when you take a play or a musical and you make it into a script, and you bring in a camera, and you bring in actors and a sound stage. And I think one of the things that you really see a lot in like straight plays, non musicals, is that plays are often about internal conflicts and the drama. And you really notice this a lot in Shakespeare. I'm not the first person to say it. The drama is in the language, and whenever you see a stage play, and you've seen quite a few bunch of stage plays, right, Randall?
Okay, yeah, sure.
You know, the laws of physics and physicality correspond to the audience. So what I'm saying, the people on stage, they may look a little bit bigger than you because they're on a stage and you're sitting down, but you know, they're roughly the same height as you. You know, as opposed to like in a movie where all of a sudden my face would be the size of a truck. And the laws of physics. I mean, yes, if you were going to a production of Peter Pan, you could maybe put someone on guy wires and they'd fly. But for the most part, you kind of know there's just a limitation to what a real human being can do visually, movement wise, in front of your face before you start going, well, I see even if you saw Peter Pan, right? You'd still notice the wires in Peter Pan in a production. And that would be a bit of unreality that you would know is unreality versus, say, watching someone fly in a movie. You with me so far?
Yeah, you're saying that movies can make the experience larger and more realistic.
Well, the camera. You know, a friend of mine who's a playwright says for him the difference between theater and film is the close-up. There's no close-up in a play. A stage play, you know, there might be a pin light. A director may try to focus your attention to something, but when you're seeing live performers on the stage, your eye gets to go wherever it wants to go.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no close-up. You're going to have to see the actor from whatever distance that particular theater seat allows you to see, you know. And it might be a great seat, it might be a terrible seat, but it's the same physics, as I would say, as me looking at you from a distance. It's you. I don't get to see the big face on you, you know, no matter how bright the light might be. And I can't see you do a lot. So, you know, there's two different kinds of things. There's like what we call on stage, there's expressionism, and then there's naturalism. And naturalism can be hyperrealism, but whether it is an unrealistic, stylized production or it has everything that looks very lived in, there's the suspension of disbelief, which is that because there isn't a camera to zoom, because you can't jump cut, because you're dealing with real human beings standing in front of you, a lot of what's going to happen is going to come from the actor's body, from their voice, from their face, from whatever they can do standing in front of you as opposed to a camera. And one of these great examples of this, I'll start with a musical, is the musical Rent. Are you familiar with the musical Rent?
Yeah, I've seen it.
You saw the movie or the play? The musical?
I think I've seen a recording of the play and the movie.
Excellent. So I actually saw the original Broadway production when it came out from like the last seat in the house. And it was wonderful. It was stunning. I love the dance sequences. I love the singing. Adam Pascal, who is the main guy, he plays Roger. It's a variation of La Boheme set in the Lower East Side. Predominantly, the story is about being a young artist dealing with substance abuse and mostly AIDS. AIDS is a very big part of the story, and he falls in love with an exotic dancer who at the end sadly dies of AIDS. And it's a really good and moving. It won the Tony. It has that song Seasons of Love, which you definitely all probably know. It's just a beautiful, beautiful play. I saw the film, with the exception of the actress who played Mimi, who was replaced. It was Daphne Rubin Vega, and she was replaced by Rosario Dawson, who is one of my favorite actresses. Are you a fan of Rosario Dawson?
You know, I'm not that big of a fan of her, but Kevin Smith likes her, so she's great.
Yeah. Well, so does Cory Booker, apparently. They're dating. She's fun and good, and they shot the film somewhat in New York and I think somewhere in Canada. And they shot it in a real city. There's no sound stage. There's maybe some sound stage work, but they really try to have a lot of outdoor stuff because it is a story that takes place often outdoors. They have the same cast, they have the same music. They try to make it as real as possible, and it's a very flat movie. You know what I'm saying? It
No,
just doesn't work.
I totally, that was like my exact feeling after I saw the movie. It was just, it was like all the emotion was somehow drained out of it, right?
Yeah, it's
And,
just it's just, and
I'll
go
say
ahead.
about the movie making process, when you watch a play or something on stage in the theater, everything is happening right then. It's immediate. It's electric.
Yeah.
The actors are doing everything. Spontaneous isn't the right word, but they're performing the entire thing right in front of you at that moment. No edits, no takebacks. But when people make movies, it's like they're doing a gazillion takes, and there's all this crew, with the camera and the lighting, and they're getting all these different angles, and they got to do the same thing over and over and over. I mean, this is why Clint Eastwood, he's like famous for being a two-take director, because he understands that you're sucking the life out of performances, You're sucking the life out of the actors when you're doing all these takes, and I don't know what the problem is with Rent,
Well, I
but
mean, actually,
it does
it's a very
fall
good
flat.
point because theater actors are used to committing the entire night. They start at the beginning of the musical or the play, and they just run until it's done. And it's different. I've actors who are theater actors who work in film and TV, and they say the difference for them is, that acting on film and TV is physical because they have to be able to just call in a certain beat, certain segment of a scene, whether it's in order or not, whether there was like a 9-hour break in the middle of the scene for them to reset the lights and just bring whatever it is. Whereas, if you're acting in a play or a musical, you literally have to stay in character and emotionally in that moment for the duration of your performance, and that's a very different thing.
Well, in
Now,
a
one of the
sense,
other
it,
things,
it makes your performance better, right? Because
it
you're in
it
that character the whole
certainly
time.
it certainly I mean, I think there's great film acting too, and I'll get to it in a sec. But one of the things that I think is also true about Evan Hansen and In the Heights that I could see in Rent was a wonderful musical because it was about people as they live today, who were young, who reflected my generation with real issues as we were living. And there's not a lot of realism or contemporaries. Musical theater on Broadway rarely deals with the generation that's alive today or the issues that they're going through. And there was so much realism in the stage production. But once it gets to film, the realism of the theater flattens out. And it's not very real because there's a lot of films about Gen X in the 90s. There's a lot of films about AIDS and drug use and being a young artist. They don't maybe have music, but everything that they had that made it relevant to contemporary theater did not make it relevant to contemporary
Well, do you
film. And you're
think?
seeing that with your Evan Hansen, and you're seeing that within the Heights. Go ahead.
Well, do you think it's possible that Rent's an example that, speaking of Rent, by the time Rent gets into being a movie, it's like it's kind of dated. Like it's not groundbreaking anymore. I mean, do you think that's
But
possible?
you know, there isn't as many years between the film and, I mean, it's a bit of like maybe a decade. So, but it's only a decade. It's not humongous. But here, let me offer you the opposite, and you can tell me. So, Chicago, the musical, Bob Fosse musical, came out in the early 70s. Then there was a Broadway revival of it about almost 20 years ago. And I caught that Broadway revival. And then, not more than a few years later, Rob Marshall, did a film production of Chicago. Chicago, which is strange enough, it is actually based on like a 1920s film. So I'm cheating just a little. But Chicago the musical, which is not like the movie that came out in the 20s, is about a woman named Roxy Hart who shoots her lover and then causes the trial of the century. And she is in jail and she meets another girl who is in the jail. And it's Chicago the musical on Broadway in the 70s and in the revival in the late 90s, early aughts. Very stylized. The set it's bare. It's a bare set. Every character is over the top. These are murderers and corrupt lawyers, and it's all about publicity. It's not sympathetic. It's not realistic. It's the acting and the characters are iconic and satiric. They're much more of a wish fulfillment of a human being or a caricature of a human being. But the choreography and is just great. It's got, I mean, it was redone every time it's done, but it's got sex, it's got heat, it has style. And Rob Marshall, when he filmed it, did not try to be realistic. His productions of musicals, he did Into the Woods, if that's another one you might have seen. His cinematic adaptations are sometimes some of the best because he doesn't try to make anything look real. He didn't film in Chicago. He filmed the whole thing on a soundstage. It looks like a soundstage. Everything about it screams over the top, not campy over the top, but almost a certain level of stylization. And when he films the choreography from a cinematic standpoint, the dance sequences in the film Chicago are so much better than the dance sequences in Rent. Now, the singing in Chicago is not as good as the singing in Rent because it's not the Broadway production. They're, Renee Zellweger and Michael Douglas's wife. What's her name again?
Catherine Zeta-Jones?
Right. They're the leads, all right? It's not great. On Broadway, it was a bit better, but not wonderful, whereas the original Broadway cast, Adam Pascal, these guys, they're really solid singers. But as good as the singing is, I honestly think when you're making a film, an adaptation of a musical, the choreography trumps the singing. What do you think of that? Why do you think that is?
Wait, when you make a musical, you mean for the stage or for the screen?
For the camera, for the screen. I think that when you make a musical for the screen, it's less about the singing and more about the dancing.
Well, I think that it is really difficult to capture dancing for the screen, and I think that that's one of the weak points of most movie musicals is the choreography, the dancing is just not shot very well, and I think it's hard for me to say I could go through maybe like my thoughts of like why the choreography is not captured right and for the screen, but yeah, I think it's a difficult thing, and I think like even top-notch Hollywood productions, they don't capture the dancing as well as you think they should,
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Rob Marshall started out as the choreographer, and he like if you really look at even the great MGM musicals, the really great musicals of the 30s, 40s, and 50s and 60s, even if they weren't based on a play, the camera knew how to capture the dancing.
Well, see, those musicals, they took great pains to capture the dancing and the choreography. I mean, that was the focal point of the whole movie. Yeah, so I mean, it's not an easy thing to do. I think a lot of these movies, they just I think they bite off more than they can chew with some of these. Like Rent maybe is a good example. I don't think the choreography, as little choreography as there was captured very well in that. I mean, like you look at a movie like, okay, a great adaptation is Grease, I think.
Yeah.
And if you look at Grease, there's not that many people on screen. There's not really that much dancing even.
There's dancing, and the dancing's pretty good. Actually.
Right, but this is what I'm saying. Like, it's not like hundreds of people dancing, okay?
But the dancing choreography is actually one of the reasons why the film is so good.
Yeah, I agree. So let me finish my thoughts.
Okay.
So the reason it works is because you have a smaller cast and you get the camera in close to the choreography. I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of great shots in Grease of like just the waist dancing the waist up, which usually doesn't work that well, but it works great in Grease because you just have so few people that you're paying attention to at a time, and just everything's shot properly. I mean, it's not an easy thing to get. Yeah, Grease looks great, the dancing looks great, and again, it's a small cast. I mean, those old MGM musicals, they had huge numbers of people, but the camera, they took great pains to place the camera. I mean, they had cameras up on cranes and, moving around the room.
The issue with you is that John Travolta in Grease is shot so that you can see the full body. and
Yeah,
that
but
makes a big difference. That makes a
yeah,
big difference.
yeah.
Full
But I know
body
there's a
really,
lot of shots in Grease that are they're not the full body, but they still
right?
work.
But the principles are using full body. That's what Fred Astaire used to always insist on. And I think there's not. I'm not sure. Look, there's a big dance. There's two big dance numbers in Rent on stage, but the way they were filmed, it just flat. So, I'll say
Right.
this
It's
much.
like they're not capturing the
Actually,
dancing.
I think Grease the movie is better than Grease the stage production.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, Grease the movie,
Yeah.
they made a if you read about it, they made a lot of changes when they brought it to the screen, and somehow
Yeah.
just everything just worked great. I mean,
It works. It works a lot better. It really does. Right down to Sandy being Australian. I
yeah.
will say there's one musical that shows that sometimes it can work equally well. I'm a big fan of My Fair Lady. I have seen it on Broadway twice, once in L.A. So I've seen it three times on stage, including once with Rex Harrison, who originated the role of Henry Higgins. And I love watching the movie. I've seen it in revival theaters in big screen on like 70 millimeter. I've seen it on little TV sets. And I will say this, the stage production of My Fair Lady is one of the best stage musicals. And the film of My Fair Lady is one of the greatest musicals ever filmed. And weirdly enough, they work. They may work slightly different. The experience might be different, but at day's end, the character and the writing in the story, the beauty of the songs, even though Marnie Nixon is the one singing, not Audrey Hepburn. Same when you see it on stage. I don't know what it is, but I think it is a work of art. It's just so rich. It comes in with issues, characters, story, melody, song, dance. And again, when you see the film production of My Fair Lady, it's very stylized. Cecil Beaton did the costumes, one of the great costume designers and illustrators. Everything, there's no pretense at realism. And when you see any production of My Fair Lady, I actually saw one which was done by Trevor Nunn, which had a pretense of realism and minimalism, and it still works. Have you ever seen either the film or a stage production of My Fair Lady?
I don't think I've seen any of them.
I strongly recommend it. I strongly recommend. Now, let's talk not about musicals because I want to talk about acting and writing and character. And I'm going to look at two different straight plays. One that adapted very successfully into film, and one of them which didn't. Harold Pinter in the late 70s wrote a great play called Betrayal. Betrayal is about two friends who are in their early 40s, who've known each other since college. And you find out at the very beginning of the play that the friend who's married, his best friend, had an affair with his wife. And then in the course of 9 scenes, we go backwards. Each scene is further backwards, and we watch how their relationship, the lover and the wife, break up, come together. We watch how the husband and the wife break up. We watch all these different things slowly in reverse. The film starred Jeremy Irons as the friend who's cheating, and Ben Kingsley is the one who's married, and Patricia Hodge, who's a great English actress and still works. She's the woman, she's the wife, she's the mistress, and Pinter was nominated for an Oscar. It was directed by a man named David Hugh Jones in 1983. I saw the film first, but I saw a production just before the pandemic on Broadway. I don't remember the director, but it starred Tom Hiddleston and Charlie Cox from Daredevil, and I can't remember the name of the woman, but the husband, who's the lead character, was played by Tom Hiddleston, and again, this is a play. It's 9 scenes. It's told backwards. It's not a high concept except for the structure, but all of the elements, what Stoppard was trying to explore in both scripts, the screenplay and the stage play, comes across clearly. The directors come across clear. The actors come across clear. The effect of watching flashbacks go further and further. The examination, all of the things that was really the intent of telling what would be a very traditional story about a man who's betraying another man, but inverted so that we can see how we get to the place. It's a story where if you ever tell a story where you start at the end, then the dramatic question isn't how is it going to turn out, but how did we get to the end? So what Stoppard is trying to achieve dramatically, intellectually, and aesthetically comes across very well, albeit differently, very differently, because that one is shot, in a real home, or maybe a soundstage, but that's shot fully within realism, not stylized at all. The stage production, bare bones stage with a rotating circle, just the opposite, dark, indicative, expressionistic. So heightened unrealism on stage, bare bone minimalism, just three actors and just their suits, glasses of wine, and a rotating circular stage that just spins around, but is otherwise black and just got some little lighting, versus something shot real, and it really does work. Now, John Patrick Shanley wrote a play called Doubt. It came out in 2005, and I saw it in 2006. I didn't see it with the original Broadway cast. I saw it with the second group, which is Ellen Atkins, Ron Eldard, and Jenna Malone. I think you know Jenna Malone from television and film.
Oh yeah, she
Anyway,
Dharma and Greg or something.
yeah, no, that's
No.
Jenna Fisher. Jenna Malone was a teen actress in movies like Can Hardly Wait. If not,
all right, I don't know
Can
what I
Hardly
will.
Wait. Anyway, the play is about a young nun who falls under the influence of an older nun. The older nun is convinced that a popular young priest at the church may be a pedophile, and she doesn't really know. And spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you how it ends. So it takes place in the early 60s, and at the end, the nun does get the priest removed from the school. But there's no conclusive proof that the priest was a pedophile. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe she's the hero, or maybe he was a really good guy who could really help young kids, and she just, based on her own fears, just got rid of him. Hence doubt. She has her doubt. And it ends with the older nun admitting that she doesn't know whether she's done something remarkably good or she's done something remarkably bad, but she has her doubt. It's a beautiful confessional moment delivered by one of the great actresses, Ellen Atkins. I've seen her in so many things. And it feels like a punch to the gut because you don't really know what you've seen, and you leave the theater with no clarity whatsoever. And it's wonderful. And then 2 years later, the playwright, John Patrick Shanley, who won the Academy Award only a few years earlier for writing the movie Moonstruck. He's a solid writer. Both he's won for both. He hasn't won a Tony, but he has won like Obie for Off Broadway, and he's won Oscar. So he decided he wanted to not only rewrite the script, but he was going to direct it, and he cast Meryl Streep as the senior nun, and he has Philip Seymour Hoffman as the popular priest, and Amy Adams plays the young nun who basically falls under Meryl Streep's spell. And at the end, it's not just delivered in dialogue, but also like in camera work and silently. And instead of feeling that the senior nun may have done something good or very bad, it feels much more clearly that, no, she probably did the right thing. Or if she didn't do the right thing, maybe she's just crazy. You know what I'm saying? But you don't really, there's no sock to the jaw. You know what I'm saying? It's like the way the film makes Philip Seymour Hoffman and the way Philip Seymour Hoffman plays it, unlike Ron Ellard. Ron Ellard he was a very handsome guy. He was on ER, very athletic, so that there was some ambiguity about whether this like Joe Jock dude, he played it like a Joe Jock dude, like maybe he's a pedophile, but he also really looks like the guy who would be your basketball coach when you were in high school, who you thought was really cool. Whereas Philip Seymour Hoffman cannot help but just come across as a pedo. So,
I haven't seen any of these, but that just strikes me as a lot of times what you see in an adaptation that's bad, especially, is they change the feel of the source material. the themes of the source material are like reversed or destroyed. The whole point of the main points of the source material are like just destroyed. I mean, you see that way too often, I think, with adaptations. I'm not exactly sure why. It's almost like people don't like the source material. Okay, I'll give you a good example of this.
Let me answer your question before you get too far afield.
I didn't ask a question, but go ahead.
But keeping in mind that no one filtered John Patrick Shanley. He didn't have to deal with another director. He didn't have to do with studio notes. He chose to adapt his own work in this messed up way. Go on. I just wanted to point that out.
Well, maybe he didn't like his previous work for whatever ridiculous reason. But, there's a good example of this is Starship Troopers, which adapted by Verhoeven. So Verhoeven...
Hold on to that just a sec, because I want to get to that when we discuss novels. But let me just finish with plays. I just literally only want to say one more thing about theater, and then we're going to go right into Starship Troopers, which is this. I have seen Dangerous Liaisons on Broadway with Cherry Jones and Liev Schreiber. I forgot the director, was a very solid director, and the play was originally a play. It was written by Christopher Hampton, and I've seen the film Dangerous Liaisons with John Malkovich and Glenn Close and Uma Thurman, directed by Stephen Frears, also written by Christopher Hampton. And here's the thing, Randall, the stage production is pretty good, but the film production, which also got Hampton a Best Adapted Screenplay win at the Oscars, is on fire. And it has all the things, weirdly enough, you would expect in a stage production, which has heat, it has sex, and it's interesting too, because in both films and the play, the Countess who is played, she is ridiculed at the end. She is made a fool in front of the royal court. But that's delivered as dialogue on stage because they don't have that anything more than dialogue. And in the film, you see this large room of people and their faces. You see the laughing and you see the staring and you see her reaction. And it's just the opposite of what I said about Doubt. The gut check, the punch in the gut that ends the film is so much stronger than the punch in the gut that ends the play. Why do you think that is, Randall?
You talk about for Dangerous Liaisons?
Yeah, from what I just described. Whereas in one thing, you're just having it described as dialogue. A woman said, "Oh, and I went to the theater that night and I saw her and we laughed at her and she walked away." Whereas that's telling, right? Whereas in the film, you're showing.
Yeah, true. I mean, it's just the movie Dangerous Liaisons. It's a period piece. There's a lot of great sets. I mean, I remember that last scene. It's like they're in a theater, right? And it's just. I mean, it's a very convincing set. There's hundreds and hundreds of extras. Visually, it's very compelling. I mean, it's way better than a woman just reading something on stage. But the movie has the budget to do that. I mean, I'm sure that if the theatrical production could do something like that, they would have. But
but even if they did, it wouldn't be the same thing. I think that is really where there's some things that you can do on live theater that really hits the human mind and the heart. And then there's things that only you can do, as Stephen Frears is a great director. But if you have a great director who knows how to work a camera and understands composition, they can achieve with visual economy what a playwright cannot. So sometimes really the filmmaker is the better storyteller than the playwright, in my opinion. Now, let's get on to adaptations of novels and short stories. And you were talking about Starship Troopers, so hit me.
Well, I mean, Verhoeven is maybe not infamous, but I want to say he's infamous for saying that he didn't like the book and he didn't even read it or something. He only read a little bit of it because, Verhoeven, he had a bad experience in World War II, and he's anti-fascist. And, Starship Troopers is possibly fascist apologetics, So they picked the exact wrong director, ideologically speaking, to direct that movie. So that's why the movie is like so completely different than the book. But he did a great job with it. I mean, it's a great whatever Starship Troopers the movie is. It's good.
You know,
I mean, it's not the book though.
It's interesting because I loaned you the copy of the book.
Yes.
So
yes.
I know that you and I have both read the book. So just really briefly, Robert Heinlein went to Annapolis, and he basically Starship Troopers, which is about a young guy who's about to go off to war with Martians, and he reflects back on mostly just the military training he got at space school, Starship Trooper School, and it really is just a veiled description of what it's like to be a young, I don't remember what it's called, a cadet at Annapolis. And a friend of mine who went to Annapolis told me that's required reading for all freshmen. All first-year Annapolis students read it because it really gives you a sense of what your life is going to be like in military and why you're learning what you're learning. Now, Heinlein had some crazy-ass ideas that citizenship should be earned like the Romans and shouldn't just be given. And he has some crazy philosophy. And you're absolutely right. Verhoeven was a small child living in the Netherlands when the Nazis invaded, and he saw Nazi brutality up close and personal. In fact, Joe Esterhaus, who was a Hungarian refugee when working with Verhoeven in Basic Instinct, said that he felt Verhoeven's violence, his lack of concern with his violence, is because he saw so much violence growing up under Nazi occupation that inured him. So yes, it is interesting what an FU. I really think that the movie is a giant FU to the novel. And folks, read the novel. The novel's a lot of fun. If you like military sci-fi or just good military storytelling, read it. It's super good. But I could certainly see how Verhoeven think, no, this is fascist claptrap. And Starship Troopers, I like it. I don't know if it was as successful when it originally came out, but it spawned a lot of other stuff, and now it's a cult classic. So it's very funny where a movie goes so... It's a great example of when they don't adapt a film well, and it's even better because they didn't adapt it well. So if that is a good adaptation of a novel which is not good to the novel, I was asking you earlier before the show, what do you think is a successful adaptation of a good novel into a good film?
What makes a good adaptation?
No, what is a good example? I think you were telling me about another
yeah. I mean, I love the movie.
Novel.
Okay, well, I love David Lynch's Dune. Okay, and most people don't love it. I'll just say right off the top. I mean, David Lynch himself is like kind of disavowed this movie. But I think, I'll say a few things about it. I mean, the visuals of Dune are amazing. This is pre-computer graphics. If you look at like the Blu-ray, there's a making of, or it goes into how they did the special effects. I mean, you'll be blown away. You've never seen the kind of special effects, practical effects they put together for this movie. I mean, they had this old 80-year-old Mexican guy. He was like some kind of master of some kind of weird special effects technique, and they used his technique all throughout the movie. I mean, you've never seen anything like this before. And there was a lot of money spent on it. The sets were amazing. And another thing is Frank Herbert, the author of Dune, was still alive when they made this movie, and he was on set as an advisor all the time. And if you read the books and watch the movie, or if you read just the first book and watch the movie, Dune, you will see, I think, that the movie captures the feel and the themes of the book like perfectly. It's maybe there's some things that aren't like totally faithful, but I think in terms of like capturing the feel of the book and the characters, it's spot on. I mean, it's and all the sets and all the visuals, it all contributes to that. It's I don't know. It's an amazing adaptation, I think. You could compare it to Sci-Fi's adaptation, where like I remember when Sci-Fi's adaptation came out, it was a miniseries, and a lot of people raved about it. But I mean, honestly, it's terrible in comparison, I think.
I had a friend who really loved it, and I'm really excited to see the new version.
Yeah, I'm excited to see the new version. Yeah.
So, I mean, I know your training is in fiction writing. You had some very good teachers at SUSC. And I think you can honestly say that Dune is certainly an example of of good writing, right? The novel Dune is a well-written novel.
I don't know. You've obviously never read Dune.
No, I
Dune is a,
never have.
Dune is an extremely hard book to read. Herbert's writing is, he uses a lot of long sentences, a lot of kind of circular sentences. It's not easy page turning kind of reading. So
But it's
no, it's
rewarding, right? I mean, you enjoyed the novel.
oh yeah, yeah. Well, it's just because there's a lot of dense information that Herbert is trying to illustrate, trying to pack in there. And I mean, he uses a lot of techniques to pack this density of this world into the books. And even after writing like whatever it is, 1,000 pages, I mean, you almost feel like you need a little bit more to understand what's going on. And actually, he did it that way. Herbert had wanted to write 3 trilogies, and he never finished the last trilogy before he died. So there's like hundreds of pages, and there's a mystery. Oh God, Chris, in the 7th novel, there's a mystery that ends in the 7th novel, and Herbert died, and no one's ever gonna know what the.
But certainly, it's a good example, of what a complicated work of real writing is, and that they could make any of it work in cinema. That's very impressive because, that's more of the challenge. There's a book by Jonathan Tropper, nowhere nearly as epic as Doom, called "This Is Where I Leave You." It came out about 20 years ago. Not even 20 years ago. I'm looking it up right now. It came out in 2009. Okay. Well, anyway, it came out in 2009, and it's about a Seder, and not a Seder, a sitting Shiva. Sorry, look at that. Jewish family in Westchester, grown-up children. They sit Shiva with their mom over the weekend, and it's not a lot of plot. It's really just a character-driven story about a family getting to get back in touch with each other as grown-ups over a weekend at their mom's house. And it was made in 2014, 5 years later, into a film. It was directed by Sean Levy, but the adaptation was done by Jonathan Tropper, the novelist. And it is pretty amazing to me how much the book and the movie, which are not either great, they're just very good, how much the movie really brought in what made the book so special. And when you watch now that I've seen both a lot, I can't even remember now what was in the book and what was in the movie, because it was the two really feel like just basically almost like an audiobook. And to me, that's kind of fun, because I think that novels are really tricky because, right, the action often takes place in the mind of the character. And I think that when you're making a movie, you're not really that in their head. You're outside looking at them, right?
Well, I'll say something funny about your comment, Chris. Is Dune is kind of infamous for this technique Herbert used. I don't know if any other writers ever used this technique. This is another thing that makes the novel hard to read and hard to adapt. Is Herbert writes the dialogue, shall we say, of characters' inner thoughts. And it's every character in the novel. You see the inner thoughts of every character, and he puts it in italics. So you have whole paragraphs of italics between the other paragraphs of what characters are thinking. And so
wow.
This book is incredibly dense, Chris. I mean, it's incredibly dense.
Well, I guess it really shows that whether the book is experimental and dense like Dune, or more of what you would come out of a traditional fiction writing school, when you can make it well into I mean, novels have some of the worst track records of a film, because I was thinking about the fact that Great Gatsby has been made, I think, twice or 3 times, and it's a great American novel. It is a great novel. I read it a ton of times, but every film version of the Great Gatsby is profound, not just a little off, but like 100 miles off.
Yeah, it's really weird. You're right. I mean, I don't know what it is about The Great Gatsby, but it's like nobody in Hollywood who adapts it seems to understand the book, right? I mean, is that
Yeah.
wouldn't you say
No,
that?
it's
I mean,
true. Well, it's like, and it's weird because everybody in literally it's the only book that we've all read. If you went to middle school in America or high school in America or college in America, you read The Great Gatsby. We all have at least a ninth grade to 11th grade understanding of the book. And yet every filmmaker treats the book like it just landed on their lap from a foreign world. It's so weird how tone deaf every version is. I will say that there's a dirty saying in Hollywood that great books make terrible movies, but terrible books make great movies. And a lot of people say, I've never read it. I've tried to read another book by him, but I hear The Godfather is just a terrible book. I hear Jaws is just a terrible book, but
some
the
people have
movies
said
are great.
some people say Gone with the Wind's not a good book. I don't know if I believe that, but it's a classic movie at this
But
point.
it's sometimes it is true that when there is less of a reason to have fidelity, I think that short stories in general have an easier time because I was thinking about how many of them had made it. Two of them won for Best Picture, but Stephen King put out he's known for writing horror, and then about 30, 40 years ago, he decided he wanted to show the world that he also knew how to write something not horror. So he put out a collection of short stories, really like a minor thing to do, right? 4 stories called The Four Seasons. And it had 4 short stories, and one of them was about a guy who works in an office who he's older in life, and he gets lucky and he gets promoted, and there's some weird mystery. Anyway, that was never made into a movie. But then there's a story about these boys in the early 60s who find a dead body, and that was made into Stand By Me. Then there's one about a guy in prison in the 1950s who eventually escapes, called The Shawshank, Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption. And that was made into a wonderful movie. Again, these are Academy Award-winning films. And then finally, there was one about a contemporary story about a boy who finds a guy who's a Nazi who teaches him how to be a serial killer. And that was The Apt Pupil. So, I mean, think about it. 3 of the 4 little short stories by Stephen King came out and became amazing movies.
Well, short stories, I think, movies, the feature-length film, like the hour and a half, 2-hour feature-length film, it's more suited to short stories, I think, than it is novels. I mean, I think novels would really be covered better by miniseries or much longer running time. For instance, this Dune adaptation, Chris,
Yeah.
that's coming out that I haven't seen yet, that I want to see. It's only based around 1/3 of Dune, which is correct because Herbert actually the book Dune is actually 3 different books. Herbert wanted to release it as 3 different books, but nobody wanted to publish it, so he just stuck them all together, and they were published as one book. So this movie is going to be the first third of that book, or the first book called Dune, and so that's the way to go. I mean, it's just hour and a half, 2 hours, even 3 hours is only long enough for like a shorter story. It's not long enough for these like gigantic novels, I think.
And if a short story is just about the right length for a movie, it's even then something that has even less story and less fidelity to a story that would be really good for one is comic books. And comic book adaptations for the last 20 years have been really the biggest genre and the most money-making genre in cinema. Comic books really, and it's weird because when we grew up, right, back in the 70s and 80s, comic book movies were the worst movies, right? Except for one movie. There's a few movies we're going to get to that they were brilliant. But like you think of like the Howard the Duck movie, which was one of the biggest bombs, or the Punisher movie, the first one, or there was a lot of cheesy, low budget, terrible. I mean, for the longest time, I would argue, with one exception, which we're about to get to, I promise, it really wasn't until Batman, Tim Burton's Batman, that Hollywood really was going to start getting a little bit serious. And I'd argue it's really not until maybe even the beginning of this century, again, we'll get into that in a moment, that comic book movies really became a legit, fully funded genre where, It didn't matter whether you were Marvel or DC or independent. You were going to throw your money, you were going to throw your talent, and you were going to make some great stuff. So uh, I think that we've talked about Watchmen, and Watchmen's a good example of this because uh, anyway, you love Watchmen. Let's talk about Watchmen because Watchmen. We've done a whole episode, folks. Go back.
Two episodes on Watchmen.
Watchmen. So this is going to be a little bit shorter, but I want you to talk about how Watchmen is one of the greatest examples of comic book adaptation done right, and not even to talk about the HBO miniseries, just comic.
Well, I'll just talk about the movie. I mean, you can get like a director's cut version on DVD or Blu-ray or whatever. So I was at some sort of years ago when the movie was circulating. You know, one of the writers did some kind of Q&A after a movie, and I was there in the room. And he said when he wrote Watchmen, the screenplay, all he did was take out his old comics for the Watchmen, and because he was a big fan, and he just wrote all the dialogue from the comic into a screenplay form, and then he slightly edited it. So yeah, when you watch the Watchmen movie, it's like exactly like the comic book. And a lot of people, you know, a lot of critics, they complained about that. They said, "Oh, you can't make an adaptation that's too faithful. That's the problem with the Watchmen movie." But I don't think that's the problem. And another thing that he did, okay, with the Watchmen movie is he improved the ending, quote unquote. Okay, so I'm sure that there's a lot of people that take issue with that, but I firmly believe that the original comic book ending from the Watchmen is not a good ending, and he changed it, and I think he made it better, much better. And yeah, I mean, and I think, you know, you're talking about like when did these comic book adaptations really break through? I mean, Watchmen's maybe a little late. I mean, there's Superman, there's Tim Burton.
Watchmen is kind of really perfect because Watchmen comes out at the beginning of the century, right around the time where everything is now. It doesn't have to be a superhero that is a household name. It doesn't have to be a superhero team. It can really even just be a cool graphic novel. There are no real stars in the movie Watchmen. There is not a lot of familiarity with general audiences, right? Watchmen was a comic book I read by buying it in the comic book shop, whereas most superheroes, you grew up reading them as a kid. So that was a good call. And I want to say, I think one of the things that really has always been an issue, we keep on talking about this with visual depiction, is that comic books exist in a very flat, stylized reality. So I think it's very challenging to translate them into film. In fact, a really good example of this is actually Dick Tracy, which just uses the 5-color palette of a Sunday Funnies. I forgot the Italian guy who was the cinematographer, but it was directed by Warren Beatty. And while the movie has issues in story and in many other things, visually, it's quite beautiful because visually the cinematographer, the costume designer, and Beatty and the production designer really do give you the reality of Dick Tracy. And whether you like the film or not, it would really be a terrible film if they had done any other kind of look.
Yeah, visually they really tried hard to get a good look on that. I mean, Popeye too, actually, but
you're absolutely right, and that's something that even if they're cult classics now, the reason we are even talking about them is because they understand that, you know, you have to find the objective correlative in cinema. What kind of comic books are so weird too, because I don't know if you know this, Stan Lee had one version of comic book writing, which is he would write a treatment, send it to his artist, describing roughly what was going on as if there was a camera with just a few key lines of dialogue, and then the artist would write the sequence as they visualized it, and then he would write the dialogue. And then some people now will just write a script with dialogue, but they describe for the artist like there's a camera. But comic books really are cinematic. You know what I'm saying? Like what do you call that in filmmaking? Storyboards. I mean, there's a lot of similarity really between comic book writing and art and screenwriting and storyboarding and filming. And what's kind of cool about Watchmen, I would argue, is I think Zack Snyder really got that.
Yeah, well, Snyder's great. I mean, I love Snyder's work, all the movies he's done. I mean, I could,
We're
I
gonna
could,
get just
I just want to say though, like, maybe like visually speaking, it was the movie that really nailed like translating the look of a comic book to the screen was Sin City. Do you remember that one?
I think it's great. Frank Miller, who had done a lot of stuff with Daredevil and Batman and Robert Rodriguez, really get it. And they again, it's very stylized, and it works really well. They're both like Watchmen, dark and broody. They really understand what was being done. Yeah, I like Sin
Yeah, I
City.
think before then they had made a movie 300 based on you reminded me because you mentioned Frank Miller. It's another Frank Miller work, and they tried to recreate like panels from the comic book, almost using the comic book as a storyboard. I think that 300 might be the first time they really tried that, but Sin City was like the real success in this aesthetic sense that they really used the comic book as a storyboard and they just completely nailed it. I mean,
Yeah,
and I think that was so Watchmen was like a turning point in taking source comic book source material seriously, but Sin City was like a may have been a turning point in taking like the just the literal comic book itself frame by frame seriously.
yeah, it's important to remember that in comic books, unlike movies, the fight sequences are pretty short. And
There's very little
comics,
fighting in actual
there's actually
comic
very
books.
little comics, and it's interesting too because in movies, the characters don't really spend that much time in superhero costume. They spend more time in their alter egos or in non-fighting modes. There's really a lot of character work. But the thing that people forget is in comic books, they don't spend as much time. They spend a lot of time they spend more time in their costumes, but they spend more time. So it's interesting because I always feel that in comic books, normally you get the hero as the protagonist. And a lot of the times, I think in films, you get an alter ego who takes on the role of superhero when the time comes. It's interesting because I forgot to mention in the musical, the emotion has to be so heightened that the character has to sing. And sometimes that translation doesn't work well in film because they're singing, but you didn't feel the emotional arc that brought them to the boiling point. And in a superhero movie, it's identical in that the call to action has to be so emotionally compelling. They have no choice but to drop their normal identity and take on the role of superhero. And I think that's why, in many ways, that comic book movies almost have the same level of stylization as a Broadway musical does. It's probably why they sometimes make them. And I also think that one of the things that you really think about when you look at comic books is uh, the characters really do need to be fleshed out for film. You know what I'm saying? Unlike a novel, unlike a play, the characters, as you said earlier, are a little bit more nebulous. So there's more room to kind of fill in, right? Who is the man behind the hero, right? What is the woman behind Wonder Woman? What's the man behind Batman, right?
You mean they have more time to flesh out the character in a book? You mean in a comic
In a,
book or a
in
novel
a
or?
movie, normally the movie is going to bring a bit more dimensionality to the character. Sometimes I think in a play that gets adapted into a movie, or definitely into a novel that gets adapted into a movie, you lose some of the three dimensionality of the character because those things really serve character well. But often in film, to make the character more than just someone in a suit, they really do stuff to make that character more three dimensional and more human. A great example of this is Tony Stark. I don't know, did you ever read Iron Man?
No, I wasn't. I didn't read Iron Man.
He was fun. I love the comic book, but he was kind of a flat character, except for the fact that he had been an alcoholic and a ladies' man and a gambler. He just seemed like a bunch of Hugh Hefner, Howard Hughes like elements, which is what Stan Lee was trying to do. But he never felt that cool or relevant. But then when Robert Downey Jr. got cast as Tony Stark, not only did he and Jon Favreau spent a lot of time trying to figure out the backstory and what was going on. But of course, as a recovering alcoholic himself, he got where Tony was coming from as someone who was charming. And he made Tony Stark not just a smart ladies' man, but a charming narcissist, a genius who was also riddled with fear and self-doubt. he added like 100 different layers of complexity to Tony Stark that was never in the comic book, but now you can never separate from the comic book because the comic book needed a Robert Downey Jr. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, sure. Well, that's the genius of John Favreau. Every project he does. I mean, I've already said, Hollywood should just build a statue of him.
Right. And I would say that's also the genius of Robert Downey Jr. That's someone who also grew up reading that comic book and found the part of himself that he could imbue. Same thing, when you look at Hugh Jackman's Wolverine. Wolverine actually had a lot of backstory, but he was so over the top. And Hugh Jackman just was able to keep that iconicism, but also add flesh and weight. I think even Ryan Reynolds' Deadpool, and Deadpool has always been a fun character. But when Ryan Reynolds does Deadpool, you want Deadpool in the comic to be Ryan Reynolds. You know what I'm saying?
I love the Deadpool movie. I think that they really captured the character from the comics. I mean, his anarchic spirit. Yeah, I mean.
This is where we get into the arguments like, who's your favorite Batman? Because, every actor who's ever played Batman has a very specific take to Batman. And either it brings something to your vision of what Batman's like in the comic book, or it takes away from what your vision of Batman is like in the comic book. And it's weird because we don't really care about which story you're telling in a movie when it's a comic book adaptation outside of trying to do the origin justice. But it's really more about how has the actor you've cast, is the actor you've cast the same as the hero you see in your head, right? Is this who I see as Superman? Is this who I see as Wonder Woman, right?
Yeah, it's tough to cast those characters, of course.
It's so character dependent. So let me talk about two movies that are really successful and why they are. And one is very stylized, and the other one is really hyper realistic. So Superman, the motion picture, which came out in 1978, and Spider-Man in 2002. Richard Donner directed Superman the motion picture, and Sam Raimi directed Spider-Man. And both of them had grown up with these characters. These were, clearly passion projects. What I just said is so true about Christopher Reeve really defining Superman from that point on. For a long time, the way you saw Superman was Christopher Reeve. And then Spider-Man, I will say that Tobey Maguire was just the right kind of actor. Even though they've been different actors since Tobey Maguire, he established that it's going to be a nerdy, unassuming guy who's going to play Spider-Man and not just like a buff dude. I think the reason that Superman the motion picture works, it's incredibly stylized. It almost reminds me of musical theater. You know what I'm saying? What's his name? Christopher Reeve started out in theater and he did musical theater. And you look at his Clark Kent and Lois Lane, and they seem like light comedic characters, don't they? She's fast talking, and he's like literally the boyfriend who gets left at the altar. There's even a song in the movie. Do you realize that? Can You Read My Mind? Which is not a power Superman has, that Lois Lane sings to Superman. It's a musical theater moment. And you know what the weirdest part is? It works. It works. A musical theater moment has no basis being there. It's not done for camp. It's not done for humor. And yet it's so rounded. And while it's stylized, when the movie came out, they said, "You will believe a man can fly." So they filmed it in New York and Chicago, and they really tried to make those flight scenes really work. Same with Spider-Man 2. You know what I'm saying? Like, you've seen Spider-Man 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the only time they bothered to really film it in New York City. And it really looks like New York City. Yeah, some of it was filmed on a lot. I've been on the lot. But the wide shots really put it there, right? And then also, Spider-Man isn't played like musical comedy. It's almost played like a YA novel, right? I mean, Peter Parker seems very real and grounded, right?
Sure, yeah.
And Mary Jane, she's got her dad's abusive. They live in Queens, and they're just looking to get out and graduate high school and go to college and move on their own. Even the villain kid, it's who plays the Green Goblin, whose name I can't remember even though I should. What's his name? The actor who plays Ned Osborne.
The Green Goblin? You talking about Defoe?
Not Willem Dafoe, his son, but yeah, Ned.
I don't remember.
You know, he's right now being banned. He was in Freaks and Geeks. He played James Dean.
Oh,
James Franco. So anyway, the whole like triangle between those three characters, you know, it works really well. Clearly, Peter is loyal to his friends, and the worst thing that could happen to Peter Parker is that he'd have to fight a friend. And the same thing with Superman the Motion Picture. You really feel that Clark/Kal-El loves Lois, but doesn't want to be loved by Lois for being Superman. And even like Lex Luthor, it's hysterical, right? Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor with Valerie Perline as Miss Texmacher. It was admittedly a little problematic by today's standards, but Ned Beatty's Otis, this bumbling buffoon. I mean, you know, I don't really think that Lex Luthor seems dangerous and evil and crazy, but he has the arrogance of the smartest man in the room. And the arrogance of the smartest man in the room, yeah, that's Lex Luthor from the 1950s. You know, the one who's mad at Superman because Superman broke into his lab and caused him to lose his hair. You know, whereas Willem Dafoe plays a man who goes crazy in trying to make something, and Dafoe does crazy really well, and it's wonderful. Dafoe chooses that note, and Hackman chooses arrogance, but they're great villains. They really do well. They play off well against our heroes. So those are when they really work. When they don't really, they're not based on a particular story. They do the origin, but once they do the origin, they do really character exploration. And by the end of the story, it's an origin story, and that you know they're going to moving forward. They're going to be Superman. They're going to be Spider-Man. So here's an example of when they both fail. Batman versus Superman, directed by Zack Snyder of Watchmen fame, and Spider-Man 2, directed by Sam Raimi, again with the exact same actors.
Well, you know, when you were, it's funny because when you were talking about the movies you loved, I was struck by a certain kind of formula that they used, which is going back to even the original Superman movies, which is you give Superman a villain played by an outstanding actor, like Gene Hackman, you know, the General Zod, you know, I mean, I forget, those three actors that played the...
Terrence Stamp played General Zod.
Those are three...
Michael Shannon, yeah.
Those are three powerhouse actors they found for those roles, you know, and I mean, that formula was used in a lot of these successful comic book movies, but you look at, like, Spider-Man 2, and what's the other one you mentioned?
Batman versus Superman.
Batman versus Superman. They didn't use that formula because they had Batman versus Superman. You know, it really helps, I think, you know, to have a villain played by
well, the villain,
an interesting villain played by a strong character, a strong actor.
If memories, there's two villains in it, but the only one I remember now is Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor, who could not be further from Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor. You know, Jesse, he plays him as like just on the Social Network, so he almost is playing him like just an evil tech genius man boy with a weird laugh.
Yeah, I don't know if Eisenberg is a great actor, but he seems to have been typecast, and so he's good at that particular role, and it's not a good role for that movie. I mean,
Mark
for Lex
Zuckerberg
Luthor.
is not Lex Luthor, and it just makes him seem stupid. And I know there's another villain in it, but I don't remember because it's about Batman fighting Superman. It's technically a sequel because it comes right after the first Superman reboot movie where he's destroyed much of Metropolis. So Batman thinks that maybe Superman needs to be checked. But at the end of the day, it turns out they both had a mom named Martha. And that's absurd, you know, and terrible. And poor Amy Adams, she's once again in this movie. And it's shot like Watchmen. Everything is dark, which doesn't work for Superman. It's way too much darkness. Superman's costume is way off. Batman's costume is way off. Ben Affleck gives one of the most flattest versions of Batman that anyone who's ever played Batman. I mean, literally, Adam West at least is a funny Batman. You know, George Clooney somehow, even if he didn't think he did a good job, as Batman did a better job than Ben Affleck.
Yeah,
I
I'll
don't
say
think Henry Cavill is bad as Superman. I just don't think he's got anything to do as Superman.
yeah, he's I think I've read some stories about him like trying to fight for better scripts and better part. I think he's out as Superman now, but I think he was as an actor. He's right. They never gave him enough to do in these movies. You're right about
And
that.
I think that unfortunately Zack Snyder treats it too much like Watchmen. And he goes to the same well. He doesn't understand what the Superman world would look like, and he doesn't even really understand what a Batman world would look like. And his over reliance on one aesthetic take. And I love Zack Snyder, but in this movie, he's a one-trick pony, and it's the wrong trick. And the same thing with Spider-Man 2. Because Sam Raimi comes in with all the things I just said that were wonderful. But do you even remember the villain of Spider-Man 2?
I don't know. Is it Venom? I don't know.
No, the villain of Spider-Man 2 is now the Green Goblin's son. It's
Oh,
James
wow.
Franco because it's a proper sequel in that it is really the sequel of what happens when you kill my dad. I will revenge him. And now they're in college. They're no longer in high school. And you would think that by following the same stuff, but as you said to me when it came out, it had too much going on. It was too much of a soap opera. It had both of these things fail. Batman and Superman versus Superman and Spider-Man 2 fail because at this point they are so far from the source material. They're so far from what makes the work that they've become soap operas and melodramas. And now the villains are confusing, unclear. Visually, there's way too much going on. And it's the kind of thing that comic books are so economic, right? Comic, you only have 22 pages to tell your story. Even if it's going to continue to the next month, you have to make every single page and every single panel move the story forward. And you have to always remember what it's about. It's about the hero, the villain, and the objective. And it's so clear. And that both of Batman and Superman and Spider-Man 2 are so bloated, right? Because they have all the problems of a successful sequel, which is they're going to do what they did in the last movie, but they're going to do it on 10. And I think it works when you're doing a Fast and the Furious movie because Fast and the Furious is not based on anything but Fast and the Furious. So there's nothing to get away from in the source material. Yeah, I'm not saying every sequel to every Star Wars movie is great, but at least every sequel is based on one good movie, which is the first Star Wars movie. Whereas Batman versus Superman and Spider-Man 2 aren't based on Superman the Motion Picture or Spider-Man 1. They're based on the comic books that we loved so much. We were willing to see these works. And that's
Well, you know what's funny
take.
is, everything all your criticisms could probably be leveled against Tim Burton's. I think it's Batman Returns, his Batman sequel to his Batman movie. Had the same kind of problems.
Yeah, I think you're correct. So,
And it had the same kind of problems like what 10, 15 years earlier,
but
and no one learned anything.
But I think those are good films, despite their brilliant mistakes. But at least there's something about them that does have a foot in the comic book. So maybe not every issue of Batman was great, but that's fine. It was Batman enough. I think just to sum things up, which is that obviously Hollywood is always going to do adapted works. It comes with a built-in market. People want to see their favorite novel or comic book or play done into a movie because then maybe they can see it again, or they can see what it looks like in 3 dimensions, or there's an expectation that somehow magic will strike and you're going to get to see something you love in a new way that has the great elements of the old work plus whatever magic film can bring to it. And sometimes we dread it and sometimes we look forward to it. Randall, what is your feeling about Hollywood's love of adaptations?
Well, I mean, I think Hollywood's just inherently conservative, so if they can adapt source material, they do it. But yeah, there's something about, I already said it, but there's something about people in Hollywood, they like to just remake things. I'm not sure why. And I was talking to you before the show, and we talked about how I think that maybe sometimes it's hard to adapt a work where the characters have any ambiguity. You know, I mean, maybe this is why comic books make the transition so often and so well most of the time, you know, because comic book characters tend to not have as much ambiguity. I mean, they're literally, I mean, they're like the old westerns, right? There's white hat characters and there's black hat characters, right? There's the good guys and the bad guys. I mean, like I'll give you a good example. There's a graphic novel called The Diary of a Teenage Girl, and I think it's one of my favorite books. It's a graphic novel. It's really it's amazing. I mean, there's nothing like it. But you know, they made a movie about it that just like kind of like just tanked all the themes of the book basically. But it's because that's a book that's just filled with ambiguities. You know, it's about a girl growing up or coming of age, and she's ambivalent about just about every experience in her life, the good and the bad. And it's fascinating. You know, I don't know if there's ever been a work like it.
Well,
But you know that's hard to adapt for a movie. You know, how do you
right.
adapt a character that is ambivalent and ambiguous? You know, you can't almost.
And if there's that, if that's what represents in a great encapsulation of when it doesn't work, why don't you end it with a really good story about a guy who wrote a lot about adaptations, which is Wilman Goldman. Please read his book, Adventures in the Screen Trade. He was a novelist and a screenwriter who did many of his own adaptations of his work and other people's work. And what he has to say about adaptation, I wish we had the time to go into, but well, let's finish it with just the story of Princess Bride, which started out as a novel. Take us through this, Randall.
Well, okay, yeah, I guess he wrote the novel and he adapted it, right, Chris?
Yeah.
And the novel is sort of a satire of aristocracy and royalty, especially medieval aristocracy and royalty. And there's whole passages of the book where he just tries to make fun of the royals and how they live, and they're very tedious and boring, and you know, intentionally. And The Princess Bride came out, and he cut all those passages out. There's almost no royals in The Princess Bride, and he just put in all the exciting adventure stuff. And then after the movie came out, there was an edition that I read where it published all the text from the original novel, but all the boring royal stuff was offset in red italics, so you could easily skip it. But yeah, it was super boring, Chris. It was so like when he adapted that his own book. I mean, he was smart. He only adapted the good stuff. And
Well,
I
it's
was
like,
I was
in
also
a weird way, it's like a rewrite, isn't it?
yeah, but you know, it's like I don't know. But the thing is, a lot of the themes are preserved. I mean, I don't know. A lot of the feeling is preserved. Like I'll go back to Dune. You know, like Herbert was on the set advising. I think if you read the book and you watch the movie, Lynch's Dune, he preserves the theme, the feel of the book. You know, and I'm reminded again of The Great Gatsby. How we were talking about that. You know, Gatsby wouldn't you say Gatsby is an ambiguous character? He's an ambivalent character. I mean, it's hard. Like even at the end of the novel, Nick, isn't he like puzzled by what was on Gatsby's mind? I mean, isn't he confused? I mean, and you know, so you have a confusing, ambiguous, ambivalent character in Gatsby, and no one in Hollywood seems to understand that or can adapt it properly. You know, maybe it's something about the cinema that you just can't capture the inner turmoil in somebody's head. Maybe it's just impossible. I don't know.
Well, and sometimes that's for the better and sometimes for the worse. The last thing I'm going to say is early on in the Harry Potter series, when they were making, well, when J.K. Rowling was still writing the books as they were making the films, they brought in novelist Michael Chabon, who's a great novelist, to help her do the screenplay adaptations. She'd also done screen work, and she admits freely that his work with her on the film not only changed the way that the films were, but it also influenced the choices she would make moving further in the Harry Potter series, to the point where she would discuss with Chabon where she was going with the book, because Chabon could know where he was going to be going with the screenplays, and that back and forth became a wonderful symbiotic relationship. And I think the beauty of that is you now have a series of really good Harry Potter films, and you have a series of really good Harry Potter books. So thank you, everybody, for listening. I know we went a bit long. Randall, great stuff. I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
We'll talk again. Bye.
Bye.